Have you ever been in a relationship that turned toxic? Maybe it didn't even start out that way, but gradually evolved into something that was very detrimental, painful, disappointing, and potentially harmful over a period of time. Maybe there were some yellow or red flags that you may have missed in the beginning or didn't see in the early stages of a relationship. And this happens in all kinds of relationships, not just romantic relationships. But one thing that I've learned in being a coach, helping single women meet and attract the right man for a loving, committed partnership, relationship, or marriage over the past 14 years, is that a lot of times we don't see signs in the beginning, and there's some reasons for that can lead us to an ultimate situation that ends up being a very toxic kind of relationship. And I believe that in order to be with the right man, you need to not be tangled up with the wrong man. Or if you're a man, not being tangled up with the wrong woman if you want to find the right woman. Now that sounds incredibly obvious. And yet, so often we invest so much of our time, energy, attention, focus into trying to create something in a relationship, or like hoping for a different possibility or outcome, or seeing the potential rather than the reality. And we end up spending months or potentially even years of our lives in the wrong relationship, many times when these relationships even have become very toxic. So what I'd like to do today is invite you to join me, and I'm going to share some of the key signs that I see most frequently that come up in relationships that ultimately lead to a very toxic relationship. Now, this is not a fully extensive list, and I'm not talking necessarily about the extremes of narcissism or abuse, although there are elements of those in all of these behaviors, because sometimes those are easier to see. Some of these things are a little bit more subtle, or at least they start out that way and sometimes grow into something more dramatic or more obvious. And so feel free to leave comments or questions below of other things that you think are yellow or red flags to watch out for in the early stages of dating. Feel free to leave your questions below. If you like this video, feel free to give it a thumbs up, and I'd be honored if you subscribe to my channel. And then also be sure to stay to the end, because I do have a gift for all of you that are watching today called 10 Secrets Every Woman Needs to Know About Men. So with that, let's dive into some of the most common signs that I see that ultimately end up creating a dynamic in a relationship that is very toxic. And the sad thing about these things is that oftentimes people are very emotionally invested by the time these things are obvious and are happening. And it can be really hard to leave that kind of relationship once we're emotionally really connected to someone. So I'm going to use a few images here just to kind of help the flow of the presentation. And I think it's nice for you to have something to look at as well. We're going to be talking about toxic relationship signs, how to avoid the wrong guys so you can find the right guy. So when we go into our dream or our wish for a relationship, what most people are dreaming of or desiring is a healthy relationship rather than a toxic relationship. And yet, like I say, my experience has been a lot of times when I talk to women for the first time, they share with me painful experiences they've had or relationships that have become very toxic, potentially even abusive and harmful. And they're oftentimes in a lot of pain and kind of don't understand how they got there. So we're going to talk about some of the more frequent topics that come up and some of the things that women have shared with me. And again, like I said, some of these start out rather subtly and then sometimes grow into something more significant or dramatic. So one of the keys is paying attention in the early stages of a relationship and keeping your eyes wide open and taking things slowly until you really get to know someone. So as I said, a key to being with the right man is not being tangled up with the wrong man. One of the tricky aspects of this, even though this sounds incredibly obvious, is that sometimes the wrong man can still be a really nice man or can still have some really nice qualities or characteristics. And so sometimes we're kind of focused on those at the expense of not necessarily noticing some of the other things that might be happening or some of the other dynamics that might be going on that might potentially lead to some toxic behavior in the relationship. Toxic relationships not only make us unhappy, they corrupt our attitudes and dispositions in ways that undermine healthier relationships and can prevent us from realizing how much better things can be. So they corrupt our attitudes and dispositions in ways that undermine healthier relationships and prevent us from realizing how much better things can be. That's by Marchant Johnson. And I think that one of the things that can happen sometimes when we're in the middle of something that is a toxic relationship is that it can be hard to kind of see our way out or to even necessarily recognize what else might be possible. It's kind of like sometimes people lose so much in terms of their self-esteem, or they lose so much in terms of what is possible because they're so emotionally involved or invested with someone that it becomes difficult to see any other possibility. So one of my clients, when she shared with me about a relationship that she'd been in, and one of the questions I often ask people when we're talking about some of the things that have happened in past relationships that have gone wrong, is I will ask them a question like, now looking back on it, I understand hindsight is 20/20, but as you reflect back, were there any signs or there were any signals that things might end up going this way? And one of my clients said, yes, there were more red flags than in a Chinese communist parade, which is kind of a funny way to say that. And yet sometimes the signs are a little more subtle and things don't really start out feeling quite that way, which is why we have to really pay attention to our inner wisdom and our inner guide. And if something feels off or if something's making us feel uncomfortable or disrespected, or like something is feeling harmful or hurtful, we need to pay attention to that rather than step over it or make excuses for it. And sometimes, like I said, some of these things start out not necessarily as red flags, but more like yellow flags, like something to pay attention to. So one thing that I always encourage the women that I work with to pay attention to is if something feels a little off, don't step over it. Pay attention to that. Just at least file it away as a yellow flag or inquire or get more clarity or information about what just happened. So, for example, if someone says an unkind or rude comment to you, instead of just kind of like ignoring it or taking it or making an excuse for them as to why they said that, you could say something like, wow, that kind of stung, or that didn't feel very good. I'm wondering if you realize how that came across, or I'm wondering what you meant by that. So in other words, you're kind of like putting them on notice and you're not stepping over it. And then you're not making an assumption about why they said that. You're giving them an opportunity to explain. And if they have the ability to have self-reflection, they may also recognize that what they did or said was inappropriate and might have a chance to correct that behavior so it doesn't happen again. And what we want to pay attention to in relationships is really behavior over time. We learn about who people are based on patterns and how we observe them to be over a period of time. So what we're really paying attention to is behavior over time. So one of the keys to recognizing that a man may be someone who may be toxic to you, and this is kind of a dramatic picture, and it doesn't always start out this dramatically, but if he has rudeness, if he displays rudeness, anger, or any signs of abusiveness, and sometimes this can kind of start out more subtly. Maybe he said kind of an offhanded comment, or something that kind of sounds like a compliment and a criticism combined. I think you know what I'm talking about with that. Or he's like more or less kind of rude, or there's just kind of an underlying stroke of meanness in his personality, or any signs of abusiveness, not only to you, but to other people that he interacts with. That's definitely something to pay big attention to, because if you see some of those signs, those potentially, even if you're not experiencing them directed at you at the moment, ultimately likely will be. So that's something to pay attention to. And I personally have my radar up around people who have a stroke of meanness in them. If there's just kind of an underlying tone or a little edge of meanness, that's something that I personally am repelled by and don't want to be around. So that's something just to pay attention to. Another one is when a man is like rushing the relationship. So a lot of times, some of these individuals that have ulterior motives, let's just say, really want to sweep you off your feet, tell you they're in love with you, want to have an immediate commitment or relationship right out of the gate. And rushing the relationship is also a technique that a lot of the online dating scammers use, or fraudsters of other kinds. Potentially, they build trust. They build like this feeling of intimacy, and it feels like they're wanting to really rush things along in a way that might make you feel uncomfortable. So that's another thing to pay attention to, because a lot of times these individuals that are really rushing a relationship, there's a reason they want to rush. They want to get you emotionally involved. They want to get you involved with them in a way that benefits them before you really know or understand who they are. So that's one to pay attention to. Another one is when a man's words and actions are incongruent. If there's not consistency in whole stories, or there's kind of this air of mystery, or things that he's saying are just not quite adding up, or he says things that don't quite make sense, or that you just feel are like not quite true. You're just like, something just doesn't feel right about some of those things. That's something to pay attention to. And then also in the way he treats you, is he consistent in terms of what he says and what he does? So incongruency in his words and actions ultimately can end up in a relationship where you're continually disappointed, and potentially, again, he may be hiding something. He may have something that he may have some ulterior motives as to why he's representing himself one way and not necessarily able to follow that up with the reality. So incongruency, if he's kind of this man of mystery, or his words are just not making sense or matching up, that's a frequent one that I've heard from a lot of women. Like, the story just don't quite make sense a lot of times. So that's another one. Perhaps he is needy. He wants or needs to be rescued. And sometimes this can be financially, or he's like going through a really hard time. Again, a lot of these online fraudsters use very sad stories and always have drama going on in their lives and troubling situations that they need help in. And yeah, this can also happen in real life. A man's really hit a rough patch, and he is a sympathetic character, and maybe he has some other really charming or nice qualities. And as a kind-hearted woman, maybe you feel sorry for him, you want to help him. Perhaps you're seeing the quote-unquote potential. But I've seen so often these kinds of relationships end up where women end up being taken advantage of and being harmed or hurt in the end. And it's a funny thing, because a lot of times, even when a woman wants to help a man, and we do want to be kind and we do want to be good people, ultimately the man oftentimes ends up resenting her even if she does help him, because it's like he begins to feel like, she doesn't think I'm competent. And in many cases, he's not. So we're in way over our heads. We are not the makeover school for wounded men. And men, you're not the makeover school for wounded women. Everyone is responsible for their own mental health and healing, and responsible for their own lives. And you want someone who can meet you where you're at. If you're ready for a relationship, don't have to be perfect, but if you basically got your life together, you want someone who can meet you in that same place. a man who makes bitter or misogynistic comments, a lot of times this is about exes or this is about women in general. There's like the bitterness and everything is everybody else's fault. And he's not taking any responsibility for any of the things that went wrong. And so a lot of times if you hear these kind of comments, again, these kinds of beliefs with these kinds of attitudes, these things are ultimately likely to be directed at you. And so this is something that is important to pay attention to, because a healthy person is going to see their part in your relationship and what may have gone well and what may have gone wrong, and will take responsibility for themselves and their own part. And they will not make the whole group of women or the whole group of men wrong, bad, evil. And so this is a sign that potential relationship could be very toxic or could turn very toxic. Someone who doesn't respect your boundaries, this is a big one, because usually if someone respects who you are and they care about you or wanting to get to know you or spend time with you for a real relationship, they're going to care about what's important to you. And they are going to respect your boundaries and your standards, and they're going to want you to feel comfortable and safe in a relationship. Another one is inconsistency, unreliability in the relationship. This kind of ties in with some of the others that we've talked about already. But the person that wants to be in your life on an ongoing basis for a real relationship, a real committed relationship, for marriage, they're not going to be perfect, but they're going to be someone who tries to be someone that you can count on, that you can rely on. They're going to be consistent in how they show up for you. And again, this comes back to this idea of why it's so important to pay attention to how someone shows up over a period of time, because that's how we really get to know who someone is. So some of the signs of a relationship that is potentially toxic are here. It's often draining and depressing, all about them. You don't feel supported. There's a lack of trust and communication, constant negative energy, all take and no give. You might just feel really depleted in the relationship. Avoidance of issues or challenges because things can turn volatile or there can be conflict so easily. And excessive jealousy, you feel like the relationship brings out the worst of you and probably the other person as well, and continuous disrespect. Now, one of the things that's really interesting to me is why it's so frequent that so many people end up in these kinds of relationships. And one of the reasons is that there's this idea or this concept called the halo effect. And that is when we see one or more really nice redeeming qualities in someone, we make an assumption that this means they are all of these other good attributes that we might like to have in someone. So, for example, if they're really physically attractive, or they have a great job, or they have a great background or family or that kind of thing, we might miss or dismiss other potential yellow or red flags because of this so-called halo effect. The halo effect is when one or more traits of a person or thing is used to make an overall judgment of that person or thing. So again, we want to go into new relationships asking the right questions, not just questions like, what do you do for a living? Or where are you from? Or where did you go to school? Or that kind of thing. But some of the deeper questions about what are your relationships like with your family? What's your longest friendship and why? What's been the most challenging thing you've ever overcome? What's the most important thing you learned about in your last relationship? What are some of the things that you would say are your strengths? What are some things that you're really wanting to enhance in your life or improve in your life? What are some of your big goals? When you're asking some of the right questions, some of the deeper questions, not in a job interview kind of way, but over a period of time of getting to know someone, you get to know a little bit more about their heart and character, and not just the resume kinds of things that we often make our decisions on or make our assumptions about people on in the early stages of dating. It's important that we have the courage to remove these toxic people from our lives. And I really like this quote here by Daniel Kopi. It's important that we remove toxic people from our life because, as I said earlier, I'm not going to take time to read this whole quote, but as I said earlier, some of these toxic relationships can have such a long-term effect and can prevent us from being ready to have the right kind of relationship in our life. And some of the work and the healing that we might have to do after coming out of a toxic relationship can take such a long time. So we might be in a toxic relationship for a certain period of time. And when and if we have the courage to break free from these toxic people, we still have a period of healing to do and oftentimes counseling. And sometimes people have a difficult time ever fully recovering, being able to totally open their heart and be vulnerable to another relationship again so that they can enjoy healthy love. So it's important to protect ourselves and not feel guilty about protecting ourselves from people that are harmful to us in our lives. And that way, if you're a single woman and you want to meet and attract the right man, you can be open and available and ready for one of the good guys. These don't have to be perfect guys, but they're going to be guys that are going to treat you well, who are going to respect you. One of the keys to a good relationship is mutual respect and treating each other with respect. So those are some of the most common ones that I see. Please feel free to leave others that you've observed or that you've experienced in the comments below. Please feel free to ask any questions, because I'm going to begin doing some live YouTube videos and webcasts answering questions from the audience. If you do like this video, please feel free to give it a thumbs up and please subscribe to my channel and make sure you click on the link in the description and below to get your complimentary gift from me, which is an ebook and recording on 10 secrets every woman needs to know about love. Thank you so much for joining me. I hope to see you here soon again. Bye-bye for now.